Okay, well, as James said, I'm just going to give sort of an overview of some of the work that the Western Development Commission has done in the area of the creative sector. And I suppose to follow on from Vera in relation to sort of the regional perspective. I mean, Vera's discussed sort of the national policy issues in relation to the creative sector. So, as Lisa's already outlined, the role of the Western Development Commission, we're a regional development organisation. So we're interested in what needs to be done at a regional level to promote this sector. So I thought I would just start off with one of these thorny issues that comes up, which is the question of definition. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about the creative industries? As Vera was saying, cultural tourism is an area that some people include when they talk about the creative industries. They include cultural tourism. Some people don't include cultural tourism. If you talk about the creative class, often it's quite broad. It includes scientists, engineers, people who are doing sort of research and development in science-type occupations, ICT. Other classifications wouldn't include those people. So when you hear figures, people are talking about different things, and it all gets very confusing. And trust me, if you go through the definitions, you could spend months and you still wouldn't come up with something at the end of it all. So when we were starting our work, we said, well, we have to come up with something. If we're going to measure the creative sector, we have to come up with something to measure. We know it isn't perfect, but this is what we're going to go with. So the definition we're using is occupations and industries centred on creativity for the production and distribution of original goods and services. So that was the basic definition. And within that, we have, I suppose, three categories. The first was creative application. And I suppose this relates to businesses that directly apply creativity to the market and to producing things directly for the market. So the sectors we include in that would be architecture, fashion, publishing, advertising, the art and antiques trade, and crafts. Now I know there can be some discussion there about crafts as to whether it should be in the second category, which is creative expression, which I suppose covers more the arts area. So in creative expression we included music, visual and performing arts. We included video, film and photography, and we included radio and TV broadcasting. And again, that says, well, radio, TV broadcasting, does that really fit into creative expressions? That brings us into our third category, which is creative technology. And these are businesses that really are primarily based on technology and using creativity through technology. So in this we included internet and software, digital media and design. But as you can tell, I mean, the lines are quite blurred between these three categories as to where things should sit. But when we were trying to measure it, we just needed some sort of classification. So I suppose when I'm talking about the creative sector, any figures I give for the creative sector, this is what we're talking about. So it's the creative industries, and there's 12 particular industries that we're including in that. So just to give you a quick background, I suppose Robert has discussed quite eloquently the fact that a lot of work on the creative sector, the creative class, has focused on the city. It's focused on the creative city, the idea of urban areas and what they can do to attract the creative class. So, as the Western region is predominantly a rural region, we were saying, well, what about rural regions? What role do they have in developing the creative sector, and what role does the creative sector have in developing rural regions? What role does all of this have in the idea of the smart economy or the knowledge economy? And how does regional policy support the creative sector? So I suppose they were some of the questions that we had at the Western Development Commission. So as our first step we decided, well, we have to find out what's out there first. So we commissioned some research on the creative sector in the region, and this resulted in this big, thick document here. There's a few copies outside, or it can be downloaded from our website. And this is basically baseline research, measuring the creative sector in the region, looking at the size of the sector and what the main issues are for the sector. So we decided that maybe people wouldn't really want to pick up and read, I can't remember, 154-page documents. So we'll make something a little bit more digestible. So we produced a slightly smaller publication, a summary of that, which sort of highlights the key findings from it and focuses a little bit more on the recommendations and the actions of what should be done about developing the region and the sector. So again, you should all have gotten a copy of that in your pack, and if you didn't, there will be more packs available outside when you're finished. So I suppose just very briefly, the Western region, we're covering 7 counties, which is all of Connacht plus Donegal and Clare. 68% of our population live in rural areas. That means they live in areas outside of population centres of 1,500 people. So 68% of our population are living in very rural areas. At the moment, obviously, the unemployment rate in the region is currently 10.8%. Well, that's what it was earlier in the year, and that was up from 5% the year before. So I suppose this is a very dramatic change in the situation in the region. But as Pat was mentioning earlier about the human capital, our education levels in the region have improved hugely over the past 10 years. I think in the future, if we look back at this era, the Celtic Tide or whatever we call it, one of the big benefits for the region will be the improvement in the education level. There was an increase in participation in third level. There was inward migration of highly educated people. And really, if we look at where we are now compared to where we were in the mid-90s, the last time we faced this kind of unemployment level, I think the education level of the workforce is one of the big improvements in terms of the position that we're in at the moment. So I suppose we're currently looking at the employment area as well in terms of what can be done in the region to develop and what sectors have potential. And some of the sectors we've identified is the green area, the green economy, the creative, the medical devices sector, which the region has a very strong cluster in, ICT, tourism, the marine, and also the elder care sector, which is definitely one of those few growth areas that you can be 100% guaranteed is going to be there in the future. So I suppose the work that we've done on the creative sort of fits into a broader issue of looking at where is the region going, where is the region's economy going. There was a very high reliance on construction for several years. What is the next phase of growth? Where are the jobs going to come from now? So just very briefly, I'm not really going to go through this because I think Robert really spoke very eloquently on the issue of the creative sector in rural regions, and often that is not fully recognised. But if you look across the EU 27, that area, 24% of all cultural employment is actually in sparsely populated areas, and I don't think maybe there's a full recognition of that. And also within the UK, obviously areas with a higher proportion of creative employment have been growing faster than areas with a lower proportion. So I suppose nationally in Ireland, unlike the UK and actually a lot of other countries, we don't actually have a national framework for the creative industries sector. There are frameworks for individual elements of it for the culture and tourism sector, for the film sector, but not for the creative industries as a whole. But the famous Smart Economy document, the framework for economic renewal does say we need to pursue an integrated policy framework to maximise the return economically, culturally and socially from the arts, culture and creative sectors. So I suppose that is an indication, and I know that there definitely is a feeling within the Department of Arts, Sports and Tourism that there is a need for a coherent strategy for the creative sector. I suppose one of the issues is that there are elements of the creative sector that don't fall within arts, sport and tourism. There will be sectors obviously that fall under the remit of Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment and fall more within the remit of Enterprise Ireland. So the need for, I suppose, a joined up approach to the creative sector and the need for a national strategy that I suppose all various stakeholders can work towards. So just very briefly, again, Pat put up the headline figures previously on the results of our research. We found there's about 4,700 creative businesses in the region. They're contributing 1.7% of the total gross value added for the region and employ around 11,000 people, which is about 3% of total employment in the region. The businesses are primarily either people in self-employment or people in micro businesses. There are very few, less than 12 or around 12% have more than 10 employees. So we're talking about small businesses here. And currently the relatively low export activity, I suppose one of the exceptions to that would be the audio-visual cluster, but in general across the creative sector it's relatively low export activity. And if we that's just quickly a map of our region looking at the employment by county. And I suppose unsurprisingly, Galway there has the highest employment, roughly 3,800, which is 3.4% of all employment in the county. The actual county that has the highest share of creative employment in all its employment is actually County Leitrim, which I suppose is a very good case study of how a very rural county has attracted particularly the arts and crafts sector. And I mean, they'll be very honest with you and say that the primary reason they were there at the beginning was because when you couldn't afford to buy land or a house anyplace else in Ireland, you could still afford to buy it in Leitrim. And that was initially one of the main drivers in Leitrim, but then it has developed into a cluster which has attracted other people in, and there has been quite a bit of support in terms of the development of the dock and other infrastructure and the Manor Hamilton Sculpture Centre. So I suppose that is a very good case study of a very rural area that's really become quite a leader in the creative sector. So I'm now going to move on to what I suppose is the main focus of the report, which is what are the main issues for businesses operating in the sector and what should be done about that. So we've categorised these into three different areas. One is related to creative people, so about people working in the business. The second set relate to creative place, so it's about the region, about place, about what's needed in an area, and the third is then about creative support. So firstly, just looking at creative people, there was definite feeling that there was a strong pool of creative talent in the Western region, but sometimes it was difficult to access. People were operating maybe quite isolated, was one person working on their own or two-person business, and they weren't necessarily able to connect with other people operating in the sector. There was also particular gaps if they were trying to recruit people from creative technology. There seemed to be particular gaps in that sector in terms of trying to recruit people with the required skills. And also people in the creative sector are highly mobile, both physically, in terms of moving into the region, moving out of the region, and also between businesses, moving around, and often, on short-term contracts. So it's a very fluid type of workforce in the creative sector. Education and training, the point was already discussed, and Helen Murphy from the Crafts Council will be speaking after the coffee break, and she will be specifically looking at that issue of education. There was a very strong feeling from the creative sector in the region that creativity was not being adequately promoted in schools, and the expert group on future skill needs 2 weeks ago just put out a report on the skills needed for creativity, design and innovation, and they make some very strong comments about particularly the second level system and the points system and how that really does everything it can to beat creativity out of you. So I think that is in terms of looking to the future and developing this sector. I mean, the people are the main natural resource we need, and are we actually doing enough to stimulate that? So in terms of the recommendations I suppose we made was, well, our first recommendation was that there needed to be an integrated overall national policy for the sector. In terms of education, that really creativity needed to be mainstreamed within the curriculum at all levels, primary, secondary and third level. And also that within the creative sector there was often a lack of business skills, and maybe it's a reflection of education, people, the boundaries between people doing an arts and design course, people doing business, and I say never the twain shall meet. So this issue of actually having basic business skills for people who have, because as I said, 39% of the people were self-employed, so if you're a self-employed person you need to have some very basic business skills to get by and make your tax returns and fill out various forms. So in terms of creative place, I suppose one of the key issues was that really quality of life, the natural environment and creative inspiration were some of the key attractors. That was why creative people were living in the region. A lot of them had moved, any of them that had actually moved to the region had done so for the quieter lifestyle, for the landscape, for some essence of the creativity of the place. The Gaeltacht was also found to be an important attractor in terms of the uniqueness of the place. Connectivity was an issue, particularly in rural areas, and a lack of sufficient quality broadband. Obviously this is an issue for every business and I think every individual who can't get access to broadband, but particularly for people who are working maybe in the creative technology sector, the issue, you might be able to get broadband, but it's not the kind of capacity that you actually need. And also, I suppose an issue that the WDC has been working on for, I'd say, 10 years now, since the establishment, is the issue of transport and issues in relation to transport into and out of the region, which I'm sure a few people have experienced over the past week. So some of our recommendations in this area would be that there should be pilots for next generation broadband in rural areas, so the creative people can actually operate where they want and where they want to live. And also there's the need for improvements of transport infrastructure, both road, rail and direct international air access. Other issues in relation to the creative place was in relation to workspace and infrastructure. And I suppose particularly for people in the art sector and the creative expression sector, often you need quite large workspace. And there was actually a lack of low-cost workspace in the region. And actually a lot of people, particularly people in rural areas, had built their own or were working from home. But particularly in city centres and towns, it was very difficult to access low-cost workspace. Though I'm assuming that the current situation may have reduced rents somewhat and might have eased that problem a little bit. There was also some concern about the impact of some of the recent building and developments on the actual sense of place and the creativity and the uniqueness of the region. Some people were commenting that some of the reasons that they moved to the region 15, 20 years ago were being lost because of some of the developments that were going on, particularly in relation to the built environment and the landscape. So in terms of the recommendations, that there is a need for high-spec facilities to be provided for the creative sector and for meeting hubs. As I said earlier, often people are working, they're quite isolated, they can be working on their own, small companies, and they need hubs to just interact and meet with other people. And also there was a recommendation that design councils should be established to give some advice to local authorities on urban design and the built environment. Maybe that idea of the importance of the urban landscape for attracting not just people from the creative sector, but people from any sector, maybe hasn't been given enough recognition in some of the developments that have been taking place. And finally, I suppose the last set of issues were around creative support, so it was the type of policies and programs that support the sector. It was found that there was quite a low level of networking activity within the sector, both between creative industries and also between the creative sector and the wider business environment. There was already discussion about the role of the creative sector in stimulating innovation. I suppose particularly the design sector can work very closely with other sectors, but that if there was more interaction between the creative sector and other businesses, it would I suppose, help to stimulate innovation across the economy. And also there was a feeling that some sort of coherent branding or marketing for the region as a creative region would help, and that there should be more opportunities, I suppose, to showcase local creativity and local creative products. So the recommendations were basically the hosting of various events to stimulate networks of practice. Obviously they can either be real or virtual. And also the need for events to bring together people from the creative sector and people from other sectors, business, science, medical devices, financial services, that actually the interaction can stimulate innovation across other sectors. There was also a recommendation that basically a website that would have be a facility for accessing other people in the sector. You know, you might be, I don't know, need to find a designer, you know, maybe have to have a joint bid or to do a joint project, that a website could be established to facilitate those sort of interactions, and also to provide information on funding and you know, various other things that are coming up in the sector. And also, I suppose we're recommending that a Creative West brand could be promoted, that could, you know, promote the region as a creative region, promote creativity in the region, and a sense, I suppose, a sense of creativity is being inherent to the West across all sectors. There was also issues, I suppose, about the eligibility criteria for funding. I suppose the funding agencies, a lot of them are enterprise agencies, I mean, their focus is enterprise. And I know that there are issues in relation to even the language between people in the creative sector and people in the enterprise sector, and the need for, I suppose, on the one side, the enterprise sector supports to recognise the value of the creative sector, and from the other side, the need for the creative sector to understand what the enterprise agencies are looking for. And also there was a feeling that there wasn't sufficient research and development ongoing in the creative sector, and that, I suppose in general, a lot of research and development funding is very focused on science and technology. It doesn't really, there isn't much funding for non-technological innovation, process innovation, design innovation, as opposed to the amount of money that's actually going into science and technology. So in terms of recommendations, we were saying that basically enterprise supports needed to be reviewed in order to assess how suitable they are for the creative sector, and if they aren't, that new the eligibility criteria may need to be changed. Also, there was an issue in relation to public procurement criteria and how much good design is actually weighted in choosing public providers. And also the need to look at the research needs of the creative sector and how the creativity can be brought more into the science and technology side of research. So I suppose finally, to sum up, the quality of life, the landscape, the heritage, the built environment, these are key factors in bringing creative people to the region, and these need to be preserved, and policy needs to preserve these. Creative talent is an asset for a rural region, and it needs to be retained. I think one of the biggest dangers at the moment, or fears, is that the current recession will lead to a return to that era of the brain drain from the West. And there's really, if we lose our creative talent, you know, that our potential for innovation and development will be lost. Infrastructure needs to be improved, both I suppose physical infrastructure, our roads, our rail, our air, and also virtual infrastructure in terms of our broadband telecommunications, in order to reduce. I mean, we are a peripheral region. We're on the edge of Europe, and if we don't have the infrastructure to access markets, you know, the world may be flat, but there are still spikes, and I don't think we're at the top of any of those spikes, looking at the maps from earlier on. And also, I suppose, to recognise the spillover impacts, and it's the wider impacts of the creative sector on innovation across the region. And as we know, obviously, public sector resources are under a lot of pressure at the moment. I know, I'm sure that Vera is working. I say it's a tough job at the moment in terms of justifying support for arts, culture and creative sector at a time when the pie is shrinking. And I think that a wider recognition of its role and its economic role in innovation will help to make that case. And also regional policy is under pressure. I suppose Robert was already talking about the city-region focus in the UK, and I think in Ireland you can see that there is, over the past 2 years, you can definitely see a move towards increasing focus on the larger cities and on the gateways in Ireland as the road to regional development. And I think, again, there's a danger that in the current recession, that regional policy and regional development will be seen as a luxury in the same way that arts and culture were seen, and that actually our focus should just be on, you know, economic development, and who cares where it happens, and that will probably just end up again in being focused on Dublin. So I think both public sector resources and regional policy are under pressure, so I think it's an important time for us to be talking about these issues and to be highlighting these issues. So thank you very much.